Before we talk about the harms of same-sex behavior, I want to share some historical details about what is considered the gay agenda. And this is a term that is considered taboo. It's considered something that's coming from fundamentalist Christians to think that there is a scary gay agenda. But in fact, this is not a conspiracy theory. There was actually a detailed strategy for how to make same-sex behavior and homosexuality specifically acceptable within the American mainstream. And if you read the shocking details of this, it's quite eye-opening. And I'll share with you the name of some of these works, and I want to quote some of it in depth for you so that you can get a sense of what this strategy entails. Our current attitude that we find amongst many Muslims is a very sanitized image of homosexuality. We don't really know the harms and we don't know the kind of depravity that is involved with homosexuality. And that's why you have people who will ask nowadays, well, what could possibly be wrong with it? What are possibly the harms of it? We find people asking that question more and more in our day and age now as opposed to previous generations because there has been this sanitization process to whitewash the reality of homosexuality. And so what's the proof of this? Well, the main essay that was published in the late 80s was from two gay men, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen. And they wrote The Overhauling of Straight America. And then later they wrote an expansion of that essay in a book called After the Ball: How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 1990s. So they wrote this book detailing a strategy, a full-fledged strategy for how are we going to normalize homosexuality? How are we going to sanitize it so that people will accept this and will consider us to be an oppressed minority that deserves liberation in much the same way that African Americans and blacks in America achieved, quote unquote, liberation and civil rights. So who are these two people? Marshall Kirk is a Harvard graduate. He was a neuropsychiatry researcher. He was considered extremely intelligent. And Hunter Madsen was a strategist and a political marketing guru. He was also a Harvard graduate. And so they worked together to write this essay, Overhauling Straight America. And so they lay out a 6-point strategy for how to overhaul America. And this is how they introduce these 6 points. They say the first order of business is desensitization of the American public concerning gays and gay rights. To desensitize the public is to help it view homosexuality with indifference instead of emotion. Ideally, we would have straights register differences in sexual preferences the way they register differences for different tastes of ice cream or sports. She likes strawberry and I like vanilla. He follows basketball, I follow football. No big deal. So immediately, this is how they introduce their project. They want to make this kind of behavior something that all religions historically have considered to be an enormity, to be vile and disgusting. They want to desensitize the public to that type of moral retribution. So what do they say? What are their 6 points? The first point is to talk about gays and gayness as loudly and as often as possible. Specifically, they say in the early stages of any campaign to reach straight America, the masses should not be shocked and repelled by premature exposure to homosexual behavior itself. Instead, the imagery of sex should be downplayed and gay rights should be reduced to an abstract social question as much as possible. First, let the camel get his nose inside the tent and only later his unsightly derriere. So if you listen to what they're saying, it's a strategy of hiding, right? It's hiding the actual reality of homosexuality, same-sex behavior, only show the public the face of it, only show the public a partial image and hide what's unsightly about our lifestyle, about our behavior, and so forth. And so this is very significant, this making the issue an abstract one, a social cause. And this is a key part, this is point number one of their strategy for overhauling straight America. Point two, portray gays as victims, not as aggressive challengers to the status quo. So this is what they say. In any campaign to win over the public, gays must be cast as victims in need of protection so that straights will be inclined by reflex to assume the role of protector. If gays are presented instead as a strong and prideful tribe promoting a rigidly nonconformist and deviant lifestyle, they're more likely to be seen as a public menace that justifies resistance and oppression. For that reason, we must forego the temptation to strut our gay pride publicly when it conflicts with the gay victim image. And so this is actually a marked change between the gay liberation movement in the pre-90s versus the post-90s. What we see in the post-90s is a deliberate effort to sanitize the image of gays in America, and so gay pride parades became something that were downplayed. Whereas prior to the 90s, gay liberation was about wearing very obnoxious, flamboyant clothing, going into public and parading in your face, trying to shock and awe the public that we are here and we're queer and we have all these kinds of loud and proud behaviors. We're not going to change for anyone. And so you would see, all kinds of sexual behavior out in public, in the street, in some of the cities that were, at the time, in the 60s and 70s, more tolerant of homosexuality. But in the 90s, in conformance with this kind of blueprint, this strategy, that was toned down and that was taken out of the spotlight as being non-representative of homosexuality in America. You want to give the image of a button-down, clean, we're just like you, we're not trying to rock the boat, we're not trying to create a big change. This is what it means to be gay. And so they had to redefine it. They had to hide a big component, a big aspect of the homosexual community in order to sell it to the larger American public. So continuing on this point, this is what they say: a media campaign to promote the gay victim image should make use of symbols which reduce the mainstream sense of threat, which lower its guard, and which enhance the plausibility of victimization. In practical terms, this means that jaunty, mustachioed muscle men in leather would keep very low profile in gay commercials and other public presentations, while sympathetic figures of nice young people, old people, and attractive women would be featured. It almost goes without saying that groups on the farthest margin of acceptability, such as NAMBLA, NAMBLA is the North American Man-Boy Love Association. It's a pedophile association. So these groups must play no part at all in such a campaign. Suspected child molesters will never look like victims. So he's very clear on what needs to be hidden, what needs to be kept from public view in order to get the mainstream to accept homosexuality. And then they continue. Straight viewers must be able to identify with gays as victims. Mr. and Mrs. Public must be given no extra excuses to say they are not like us. To this end, the persons featured in the public campaign should be decent and upright, appealing and admirable by straight standards, completely unexceptional in appearance. In a word, they should be indistinguishable from the straights we would like to reach. Only under such conditions will the message be read correctly. These folks are victims of a fate that could have happened to me. So, subhanAllah, this is very upfront, it's very interface, exactly what they want to do to essentially deceive the public into accepting them as victims. So that's point number two. Number three, give protectors a just cause. Give protectors a just cause. What do they mean by this? Our campaign should not demand direct support for homosexual practices, but instead should take anti-discrimination as its theme. The right to free speech, freedom of beliefs, freedom of association, due process, and equal protection of laws. These should be the concerns brought to mind by our campaign. It's especially important for the gay movement to hitch its cause to accepted standards of law and justice. So this is a very important shift in, again, the gay liberation discourse. We want to be seen as a oppressed minority, just like blacks, just like other groups, minority groups. We want to be considered in that light as well, because it's not obvious. It's not obvious why, just because you have a certain kind of sexual desire or sexual practice, why should you be considered a minority group? There are many people who have different fetishes, who have paraphilias, and would we consider each one of these kinds of desires its own community and its own minority group? No, that would be ridiculous, and that's not even accepted within Western standards. And definitely as Muslims, why should we accept that? Again, this goes back to the caveat that I mentioned at the beginning of the course, where we don't want to adopt the language that will force us into accepting certain moral positions. And that's why we should not use the term LGBT community, except ironically, because we should not accept and acknowledge that this is an actual minority group. No, it's just a wide variety of people who have a certain kind of desire. And we don't define people according to their desires. But this is a conscious part of the gay agenda to make it about anti-discrimination. Don't focus on the sexual behavior. Don't focus on the moral component, which is what we're concerned about as Muslims and which all of society should be concerned about the moral component. Don't focus on that. Just focus on this is anti-discriminatory. This is discriminatory to not accept this behavior, to not support gay rights. And so this is how they want the public to come on their side. The fourth point, make gays look good. You know, pretty simple. And then on this point, they say, to return to the terms we have used in previous articles, spokesmen for our cause will be R-type straight gays, rather than Q-type homosexuals on display. So again, they're making it very clear. We want to have the buttoned up, the more acceptable looking straight gays, meaning gays that are not going to seem bizarre, not going to seem weird, the R types, whereas the Q types, the ones that are loud and proud and who might dress differently, who are more flamboyant, no, we need to keep them out of sight and not have them on display. The fifth point, make the victimizers look bad. Okay, this is a very important part of their strategy. And they say, our goal here is twofold. First, we seek to replace the mainstream's self-righteous pride about its homophobia with shame and guilt. Second, we intend to make the anti-gays look so nasty that average Americans will want to disassociate themselves from such types. So make it seem like anyone who opposes homosexuality and gay rights is part of the KKK or is a neo-Nazi, or portray them as just irrational, raving, angry lunatics. And so then the public will want to disassociate themselves from these types and be more aligned with the victims as opposed to the victimizers. So that's the fifth point of their strategy. And then the sixth point is about funds, raising funds from corporate America. Make corporate America see us as this oppressed minority that deserves funding, that deserves support. And we see that nowadays in 2018, 2019, that corporations, you can't find a corporation that doesn't have a rainbow logo, that isn't going to be decked out with rainbows and gay pride when it's Gay Pride Month or Gay Pride Week or whatever they're doing. So this is something that has become ubiquitous. We find corporations are now the biggest pushers of this kind of gay celebration. And then also media strategy. So this was their deliberate strategy, is to influence the media through ads, through newspaper ads, magazine ads, and then TV ads. Make sure to include sympathetic, good characters, gay characters within TV, within movies. This is an important part of changing the status quo about homosexuality in America. And so this is just the 90s. We're not talking about hundreds of years ago. We're not even talking about half a century ago. We're just talking about 20, 30 years ago, how this strategy has been implemented. And that's why we see such a huge shift in the mentality about homosexuality within America and within the West more broadly. And this was an interesting quote from their essay. The subject should be interviewed alone. So they're talking about ads and also TV interviews. How should homosexuals look on these kinds of ads? And they say the subject should be interviewed alone, not with their lovers or their children, for to include others in the picture would unwisely raise disturbing questions about the complexities of gay social relations, which these commercials could not explain. It's best instead to take one thing at a time. So again, don't show their lovers, don't show children, just show an individual. An individual on screen just looks like a person. And so that's not going to raise all of these difficult questions, these important moral questions that people have when they think about the concept of homosexuality. So now with this 6-point strategy and the book After the Ball, which I mentioned before, and this whole blueprint for changing public opinion, someone might say, okay, Daniel, this is not a gay agenda. This is just the strategizing of any political action group. Any group is going to want to take measures like this to advance their interests. So what do we say to this? My response to this is that, fine, you have groups that will strategize, of course, but this was different. This was a strategy to deliberately conceal and mischaracterize the reality of the group, and it's explicit within this document. The image that they invoke, we want to get the head of the camel in the tent and not show the derriere, the rear of the camel, right? And so they don't want to talk about the sexuality aspect. They don't want to talk about the social relations aspect. They want to make it as abstract as possible so that people thinking of it in the abstract can say, well, I prefer chocolate, other people prefer vanilla. I prefer basketball, other people prefer football. It becomes a very abstract issue, but if you include the details, that's where people are going to be less likely to come onto your side and adopt all of that baggage that comes with homosexuality, because people can see how deviant it is, how harmful it is, how bizarre and alien it is to everyone's life, essentially everyone's life. So we're going to go into the details of this, inshallah, in the coming modules.